In the bitter winter of 1861, along the frost-covered bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River outside Hannibal, Missouri, Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore operated what appeared to be the most refined boarding establishment in the entire Mississippi River Valley. Over the course of 22 months, 53 travelers sought refuge within the grand halls of Whitmore Estate, drawn by advertisements promising elegant accommodations, gourmet cuisine, and the kind of sophisticated hospitality that reminded weary visitors of better times before the nation descended into civil war. Not one of these guests was ever seen alive again after entering the ornate double doors of the imposing mansion that stood like a cathedral of Southern grace against the harsh Missouri landscape. Local authorities documented 24 separate investigations into missing persons, all of whom had last been observed climbing the marble steps leading to Evangeline Whitmore's reception parlor. The official records were sealed by federal marshals and buried in territorial archives when the case threatened to expose a network of corruption involving military suppliers, political appointees, and financial institutions throughout the upper Mississippi region. But the truth about Mrs. Whitmore and her establishment reveals a sophistication in evil that transformed the sacred bonds of hospitality into an enterprise of such calculated brutality that it defied every assumption about the capacity for civilization to mask primitive savagery. Before we explore the horrifying reality behind the silk curtains and crystal chandeliers of Whitmore Estate, and the woman whose refinement concealed an appetite for human destruction that shocked even battle-hardened Civil War investigators accustomed to the worst extremes of wartime violence, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's most disturbing historical mysteries. And please share in the comments which state you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of brave viewers who aren't afraid to confront the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of our nation's past. The Missouri of 1861 existed in a state of suspended animation between civilization and chaos, caught in the gravitational pull of a conflict that would ultimately consume over 600,000 American lives. While officially remaining loyal to the Union, Missouri's population was fractured along lines that ran deeper than mere political disagreement. The state had become a battleground not just between North and South, but between competing visions of American identity itself. Hannibal, Missouri, perched on the western bank of the Mississippi River like a jewel of antebellum prosperity, had once been the beating heart of American commerce and culture. The great paddle-wheel steamboats that churned up and down the mighty river carried not just cargo and passengers, but ideas, dreams, and the restless energy of a nation convinced of its manifest destiny. Mark Twain himself had grown up in this river town, absorbing the rhythms of Mississippi life that would later flow through his greatest works. But by 1861, the river that had once united the nation had become a contested highway through hostile territory. Union gunboats patrolled the Mississippi, searching for Confederate sympathizers and contraband goods. Confederate irregulars launched raids from hidden camps along the Missouri and Arkansas shores. Legitimate merchants struggled to distinguish between lawful trade and treasonous activity, while ordinary citizens found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict that seemed to grow more brutal and unforgiving with each passing month. The economic disruption caused by the war had created a massive population of displaced persons throughout the Mississippi Valley. Families fled their homes to escape advancing armies or retreating guerrilla bands. Businessmen relocated their operations to safer territory. Soldiers traveled in civilian clothes to avoid capture by enemy forces. Young men sought to reach recruiting stations in distant cities where their political sympathies would be welcomed rather than persecuted. Into this desperate landscape came a steady stream of refugees, travelers, and displaced persons seeking temporary shelter while they navigated the dangerous passage through Missouri's contested territory. The traditional network of inns, boarding houses, and private homes that had once provided reliable accommodation for travelers had been disrupted by the war. Many establishments had closed due to economic hardship or security concerns. Others had been destroyed by military action or guerrilla raids. The few remaining places of accommodation faced constant challenges. How to determine whether potential guests were legitimate travelers or enemy agents. How to maintain adequate supplies when normal commercial networks had been disrupted. How to protect their establishments from the violence that seemed to follow the war wherever it spread. Most innkeepers adopted a cautious approach, accepting only guests who came with reliable recommendations or who could provide convincing proof of their identity and purposes. Against this backdrop of uncertainty and danger, the emergence of Whitmore Estate as a beacon of stability and refinement seemed nothing short of miraculous. The property itself commanded attention from anyone approaching Hannibal by river or road. A magnificent three-story mansion built in the Greek Revival style with towering white columns, extensive verandas, and grounds that stretched for nearly 40 acres along the river bluff.
The mansion had been constructed in 1847 by Colonel Jefferson Blackwood, a cotton planter who had made his fortune in the Mississippi Delta before relocating to Missouri to establish a dynasty that would span generations. Blackwood had spared no expense in creating a monument to Southern prosperity and refinement. The house featured imported marble floors, crystal chandeliers from France, furniture crafted by master artisans in New Orleans, and architectural details that rivaled the finest plantation houses of Louisiana and Mississippi. But the war had been cruel to Colonel Blackwood's ambitions. His cotton empire collapsed when Union forces seized control of the Mississippi River, cutting off his supply lines and markets. His 3 sons died within a single month during the Battle of Shiloh, leaving him without heirs to carry on the family name. His wife succumbed to pneumonia during the harsh winter of 1860, unable to survive the combination of grief and the physical hardships imposed by wartime shortages. By the spring of 1861, Colonel Blackwood faced financial ruin and personal devastation. The magnificent house that had once symbolized his success had become an empty monument to dreams destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. When Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore approached him with an offer to purchase the property, Blackwood saw it as divine intervention that would allow him to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. Mrs. Whitmore presented herself as a widow from Savannah, Georgia, whose late husband had been a prosperous merchant dealing in luxury goods imported from Europe. She claimed to have liquidated her husband's business holdings just before the war began, recognizing that the coming conflict would disrupt international trade for years to come. Her decision to invest in Missouri real estate, she explained, reflected her belief that the state's strategic location would make it valuable regardless of which side ultimately won the war. The transaction was completed with remarkable efficiency, considering the chaotic conditions that prevailed throughout the region. Mrs. Whitmore paid in gold coin, a form of currency that had become increasingly rare as both the Union and Confederate governments struggled to finance their military operations. She also demonstrated familiarity with legal procedures and business customs that impressed the lawyers and bankers involved in the sale. Within weeks of taking possession of the property, Mrs. Whitmore had begun an extensive renovation program that transformed the mansion into what she described as a refuge for discriminating travelers seeking the refinements of civilization during these troubled times. The work was carried out by craftsmen and laborers brought in from St. Louis and Chicago, men who possessed skills that had become scarce in the Mississippi Valley as the war absorbed available manpower. The renovations focused on creating luxurious guest accommodations while maintaining the architectural integrity that made the house such an impressive sight. The second and third floors were converted into spacious suites, each featuring private sitting areas, elegant furnishings, and amenities that surpassed anything available in the region's remaining hotels. The dining room was expanded to accommodate 30 guests at a single sitting, while the kitchen facilities were modernized to support the kind of elaborate meal service that Mrs. Whitmore promised in her promotional materials. Perhaps most importantly, Mrs. Whitmore invested heavily in security measures that reflected the dangerous realities of wartime Missouri. The property was surrounded by a wrought iron fence that appeared decorative but served to control access to the grounds. Discreet guardhouses were built at strategic points around the estate, designed to blend with the landscape while providing clear fields of observation and fire. The mansion itself was reinforced with steel shutters that could be closed to protect the windows, while the basement was converted into a secure area that could serve as a refuge during raids or attacks. Mrs. Whitmore herself was perhaps the most impressive aspect of the entire establishment. She appeared to be a woman in her early 40s, with the kind of refined beauty that suggested excellent breeding and careful attention to maintaining her appearance despite the hardships of wartime life. Her clothing was always impeccable, featuring fabrics and styles that demonstrated both substantial financial resources and sophisticated taste in fashion. But it was Mrs. Whitmore's personality and social skills that truly set her apart from other business operators in the region. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to make every guest feel uniquely valued and understood, regardless of their background, political sympathies, or personal circumstances. Wealthy plantation owners found her conversation informed by intimate knowledge of Southern society and culture. Northern businessmen discovered that she understood the complexities of industrial development and financial markets. Military officers, whether Union or Confederate, encountered a woman who could discuss strategy, logistics, and military history with remarkable sophistication. Dr. Amelia Richardson, one of the few female physicians practicing in the Mississippi Valley, first encountered Mrs. Whitmore in October 1861. Dr. Richardson had been traveling from St. Louis to New Orleans to assist in treating yellow fever victims when political tensions made river travel increasingly dangerous for a woman traveling alone. The reputation of Whitmore Estate as a safe haven for respectable travelers had reached her through professional colleagues, who praised both the quality of the accommodations and Mrs. Whitmore's personal attention to guests' needs. Dr. Richardson would later write in her medical journal that her first impression of Mrs. Whitmore was of a woman who seemed to embody all the virtues that Southern society claimed to represent: grace, intelligence, hospitality, and an almost maternal concern for the welfare of others. Mrs. Whitmore personally greeted Dr. Richardson at the mansion's front entrance, immediately recognizing her profession and expressing genuine admiration for the courage required to practice medicine during such dangerous times. The conversation that followed demonstrated Mrs. Whitmore's remarkable ability to connect with people from vastly different backgrounds and circumstances. She questioned Dr. Richardson about her medical training, her experiences treating both civilian patients and military casualties, and her observations about the public health challenges created by the war. Mrs. Whitmore's questions revealed not just polite interest, but genuine understanding of medical science and its practical applications. During Dr. Richardson's 3-day stay at Whitmore Estate, she observed Mrs. Whitmore's interactions with a diverse group of guests that included a cotton merchant from Memphis, a family of German immigrants relocating to Kansas, 2 Union Army officers traveling in civilian clothes, and the mysterious individual who claimed to be a journalist but whose true purposes remained unclear. In each case, Mrs. Whitmore demonstrated the same remarkable ability to establish rapport and provide exactly the kind of attention that each guest seemed to need. The cotton merchant found Mrs. Whitmore knowledgeable about market conditions, transportation routes, and the political factors affecting trade throughout the Mississippi Valley. She provided him with detailed information about which river ports remained operational and which had been closed by military action, knowledge that proved invaluable for a man trying to salvage his business from the wreckage of the cotton economy. The German family, struggling with language barriers and unfamiliarity with American customs, discovered that Mrs. Whitmore spoke fluent German and possessed extensive knowledge of immigrant settlement patterns in the Midwest. She provided them with letters of introduction to German-speaking communities in Kansas, along with practical advice about land purchases, farming techniques adapted to prairie conditions, and the political dynamics they would encounter in their new home. The Union officers, initially suspicious of accepting hospitality from a Southern-born woman, found Mrs. Whitmore's political views to be moderate and her loyalty to the Union apparently sincere. She expressed support for preserving the nation's unity while deploring the violence that had consumed both North and South. Her conversations with the officers revealed detailed knowledge of military logistics, strategic geography, and the challenges of maintaining discipline among volunteer forces recruited from civilian populations. Even the mysterious journalist discovered that Mrs. Whitmore possessed insights into the information networks that operated throughout the war zone, knowledge that proved valuable for a man whose profession required him to gather and verify information from unreliable sources in dangerous circumstances. Dr. Richardson was particularly impressed by Mrs. Whitmore's attention to the comfort and security of her guests. The meals served at Whitmore Estate rivaled anything available in the finest restaurants of St. Louis or New Orleans, featuring fresh meat, vegetables, and dairy products that had become luxuries in many parts of the war zone. The wine cellar contained bottles from France, Germany, and California that must have cost substantial sums to acquire during wartime conditions. The guest accommodations exceeded Dr. Richardson's highest expectations. Her suite featured a private sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom with a massive four-poster bed imported from New Orleans, and a private bathroom with running water and modern plumbing fixtures that were rare even in major cities. The linens were of the finest quality. The furniture was both beautiful and comfortable, and every detail suggested the kind of attention that only the most expensive hotels in major cities could provide. But perhaps most impressive was Mrs. Whitmore's obvious concern for the security and safety of her guests. The property was patrolled by discreet guards who maintained vigilance without creating an atmosphere of anxiety or suspicion. Mrs. Whitmore personally briefed each departing guest about current conditions along their intended route of travel, providing information about safe stopping points, areas to avoid, and contacts who could provide assistance if problems arose. Dr. Richardson departed Whitmore Estate with nothing but admiration for Mrs. Whitmore and her establishment. She recommended the inn to colleagues throughout the region, describing it as a miraculous oasis of civilization in a landscape increasingly dominated by violence and uncertainty.
The commercial success of Whitmore Estate during the early months of the war seemed to confirm Mrs. Whitmore's genius for understanding exactly what weary travelers needed during such difficult times. Word of the establishment's exceptional quality spread throughout the Mississippi Valley through a network of satisfied guests who shared their experiences with friends, colleagues, and business associates. Mrs. Whitmore's marketing approach was subtle but highly effective. Rather than relying on newspaper advertisements, which could attract unwanted attention from military authorities or criminal elements, she built her reputation through personal recommendations and discreet word-of-mouth promotion among the kind of prosperous, respectable travelers who could afford her premium rates. The guest registry at Whitmore Estate during the winter of 1861 to 1862 read like a directory of the Mississippi Valley's most prominent citizens.
wealthy planters fleeing the disruption of agricultural production, successful merchants attempting to maintain business relationships despite the collapse of normal transportation and communication networks, professional men, doctors, lawyers, engineers seeking opportunities in regions less affected by military action, military officers and government officials traveling on business that required discreet accommodation away from official channels. Each of these guests paid substantial sums for the privilege of staying at Whitmore Estate, rates that reflected both the exceptional quality of the service and the premium that security commanded during dangerous times. Mrs. Whitmore's financial records, maintained with the precision that characterized every aspect of her operation, showed gross revenues that exceeded the annual income of most successful businesses in the region. But the truly remarkable aspect of Mrs. Whitmore's business model was her ability to maintain consistently high occupancy rates despite the disruption caused by the war. While other accommodation providers struggled to attract guests, Whitmore Estate remained fully booked months in advance. Mrs. Whitmore attributed this success to her policy of accepting only guests who came with reliable recommendations or who could provide convincing evidence of their respectability and financial resources. The selection process itself became part of Whitmore Estate's reputation for exclusivity. Potential guests were required to submit detailed letters of application describing their background, their reasons for travel, and their expected duration of stay. Mrs. Whitmore personally reviewed each application, sometimes conducting additional research to verify the applicant's identity and circumstances before extending an invitation to visit the estate. This careful screening process served multiple purposes. It ensured that only genuinely prosperous travelers would be accepted, guaranteeing that Mrs. Whitmore could maintain her premium rates. It created an atmosphere of exclusivity that enhanced the property's reputation among the kind of status-conscious individuals who comprised her target market. Most importantly, it provided Mrs. Whitmore with detailed information about each guest's background, resources, and travel plans before they arrived at the estate. The information gathering extended far beyond the formal application process. Mrs. Whitmore maintained an extensive correspondence network throughout the Mississippi Valley, exchanging letters with business associates, social contacts, and professional colleagues who could provide additional details about potential guests. She subscribed to newspapers from major cities throughout the region, carefully tracking the movements and activities of prominent individuals who might eventually seek accommodation at her establishment. Mrs. Whitmore also cultivated relationships with transportation companies, particularly the steamboat operators who provided passenger service along the Mississippi River. These relationships served both promotional and intelligence purposes, allowing her to identify prospective guests while they were still traveling toward Hannibal, and to gather information about their resources, traveling companions, and ultimate destinations. The result was a business operation that seemed to anticipate and fulfill every need of its carefully selected clientele. Guests arriving at Whitmore Estate found that Mrs. Whitmore already knew details about their background and circumstances that allowed her to provide personalized service from the moment they entered the mansion. She could discuss their business interests, inquire about mutual acquaintances, and demonstrate familiarity with their home communities in ways that created immediate bonds of trust and appreciation. The smooth operation of Whitmore Estate required a substantial staff of skilled professionals who shared Mrs. Whitmore's commitment to providing exceptional service while maintaining the security measures necessary for operating in a war zone. Mrs. Whitmore had assembled a team of employees whose backgrounds and skills reflected her sophisticated understanding of what would be required to create a truly world-class establishment under challenging circumstances.
The culinary program was supervised by Chef Auguste Beaumont, a French-trained professional who had worked in the finest restaurants of New Orleans before accepting Mrs. Whitmore's offer of employment at Whitmore Estate. Beaumont's ability to create gourmet meals using ingredients available during wartime conditions was considered almost miraculous by guests accustomed to the limited food options available at other establishments throughout the region. The household staff included experienced professionals recruited from the finest families and establishments throughout the South. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Ashworth, had previously managed the domestic operations of a major plantation in Louisiana. The personal valets and ladies' maids possessed training and experience that allowed them to provide the kind of personal service that wealthy travelers expected but rarely encountered during their journeys through the war zone. The security arrangements at Whitmore Estate were comprehensive but discreet, designed to provide maximum protection without creating an atmosphere of military occupation that might disturb the refined ambiance that Mrs. Whitmore worked so carefully to maintain. The property was monitored around the clock by guards who remained largely invisible to guests but who maintained constant communication through a system of signals and checkpoints that ensured immediate response to any threat or emergency. The operational procedures developed by Mrs. Whitmore reflected her understanding that success in the hospitality business required attention to countless details that guests should never have to notice or consider. Meals were served at precisely scheduled times using fine china, crystal, and silver service that created an atmosphere of formal elegance. Guest rooms were maintained at consistently comfortable temperatures through a sophisticated heating system that utilized the latest technological innovations. Personal laundry and valet services ensured that guests could maintain their appearance and social standing regardless of the conditions they had encountered during their travels. But the most impressive aspect of Mrs. Whitmore's operation was her ability to create an atmosphere of safety and normalcy that allowed guests to relax and enjoy themselves despite the violence and uncertainty that surrounded the estate. The mansion's public areas featured comfortable seating arrangements, extensive libraries, musical instruments, and games that encouraged social interaction among guests from diverse backgrounds and circumstances. Evening entertainment programs included musical performances, literary discussions, and informal lectures by guests who possessed specialized knowledge or interesting experiences to share with their fellow travelers. Mrs. Whitmore herself was often the center of these gatherings, demonstrating a remarkable ability to guide conversations that allowed each participant to shine while avoiding topics that might create political tensions or personal conflicts. The result was an establishment that functioned as much more than a simple accommodation provider. Whitmore Estate became a temporary community where travelers could form friendships, exchange information, and enjoy the kind of intellectual and social stimulation that had become rare in a world increasingly dominated by the brutal necessities of warfare. Dr. Richardson would later reflect that her time at Whitmore Estate had been among the most pleasant and memorable experiences of her professional career. A brief respite from the harsh realities of practicing medicine during wartime that renewed her faith in the possibility of maintaining civilization and human dignity even under the most challenging circumstances. It would be several years before Dr. Richardson learned the true nature of the hospitality she had experienced, and the knowledge would haunt her for the remainder of her life. Professor Benjamin Hartwell arrived at Whitmore Estate on a cold February morning in 1862, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the sharp air as his hired carriage climbed the winding drive toward the imposing mansion. Hartwell, a professor of criminal anthropology at Harvard University, had traveled to Missouri on assignment from the federal government to document the effects of civil war on civilian populations throughout the Mississippi Valley region. At 42 years of age, Professor Hartwell possessed the kind of analytical mind that had made him one of the nation's leading experts on human behavior under extreme circumstances. His academic work had focused on the psychological effects of violence on both perpetrators and victims, research that had gained new urgency as reports of civilian atrocities began filtering back from the war's expanding theaters of operation. The professor's initial impression of Whitmore Estate aligned perfectly with the glowing recommendations he had received from colleagues throughout the academic community. The mansion stood against the winter landscape like a monument to architectural ambition. Its Greek Revival columns and sweeping verandas suggested the kind of prosperity and stability that had become increasingly rare throughout the war zone.
Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore greeted Professor Hartwell personally at the mansion's entrance, demonstrating the same remarkable ability to establish immediate rapport that had impressed every previous guest. Within minutes of their introduction, she had identified his academic specialization and expressed genuine fascination with his research into the psychological dimensions of social conflict. "Professor Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of educated Southern society, "how remarkable that we should have the opportunity to host someone engaged in such vital work. I imagine your observations about the effects of this terrible war on ordinary citizens could provide insights that might help us all better understand what we're experiencing." The conversation that followed revealed Mrs. Whitmore's sophisticated understanding of psychological theory and social science methodology. She questioned Hartwell about his research techniques, his observations about regional differences in civilian responses to military occupation, and his theories about the long-term social consequences of prolonged exposure to violence and uncertainty. Professor Hartwell found himself genuinely impressed by Mrs. Whitmore's intellectual curiosity and analytical sophistication. Her questions demonstrated not just polite interest, but genuine understanding of the theoretical frameworks that guided his research. She spoke knowledgeably about European developments in criminal anthropology, recent advances in medical understanding of traumatic stress, and the practical challenges of conducting systematic research under wartime conditions. During his first evening at Whitmore Estate, Professor Hartwell observed Mrs. Whitmore's interactions with the current group of guests, which included a fascinating cross-section of Mississippi Valley society. A wealthy cotton factor from Natchez was attempting to salvage his business by establishing new trading relationships with northern merchants. A family of German immigrants was traveling west to establish a farming operation in Nebraska Territory. Two Confederate officers traveling in civilian clothes on what appeared to be official business maintained careful anonymity while enjoying the estate's hospitality. Mrs. Whitmore navigated these potentially explosive social dynamics with remarkable skill. She managed to maintain conversations that allowed each guest to feel valued and understood, while carefully avoiding topics that might reveal conflicting political loyalties or create personal tensions. Her ability to identify and deflect potential conflicts seemed almost supernatural in its precision and effectiveness. The cotton factor found Mrs. Whitmore knowledgeable about market conditions, transportation logistics, and the complex legal issues surrounding trade between regions controlled by opposing military forces. She provided him with detailed information about northern business customs, regulatory requirements, and the personal characteristics of potential trading partners that demonstrated extensive knowledge of commercial networks throughout the Mississippi Valley. The German family discovered that Mrs. Whitmore spoke fluent German and possessed detailed knowledge of immigrant settlement patterns, agricultural techniques adapted to prairie conditions, and the political dynamics they would encounter in their new home. Her advice about land purchases, community selection, and cultural adaptation reflected the kind of practical wisdom that typically required years of direct experience to acquire. Even the Confederate officers, initially suspicious of discussing their circumstances with strangers, found Mrs. Whitmore's conversation sufficiently informed about military affairs to earn their respect and trust. She demonstrated familiarity with strategic geography, logistical challenges, and the professional concerns that occupied military personnel regardless of their political allegiances. Professor Hartwell was particularly intrigued by Mrs. Whitmore's apparent ability to gather and retain detailed information about each guest's background, interests, and circumstances. Her conversations revealed knowledge that extended far beyond what could be obtained through casual social interaction.
She seemed to possess comprehensive intelligence about business conditions, political developments, and social networks throughout the region that suggested access to information sources normally available only to government officials or major commercial organizations. The mysterious disappearance of Mr. Cornelius Ashford marked the beginning of Professor Hartwell's gradual recognition that something was fundamentally wrong at Whitmore Estate, although the significance of the incident would not become clear until much later investigation revealed its true nature. Cornelius Ashford was a prosperous merchant from Louisville, Kentucky, who specialized in importing luxury goods from Europe for sale to wealthy customers throughout the Mississippi Valley. The disruption of international trade caused by the war had forced Ashford to adapt his business model, focusing instead on acquiring scarce goods within the United States for resale in markets where demand remained strong despite wartime shortages. Ashford had arrived at Whitmore Estate on February 15, 1862, carrying a substantial quantity of gold coins and valuable merchandise that he planned to sell to customers in St. Louis and Chicago. His luggage included jewelry, fine fabrics, imported wines, and other luxury items that commanded premium prices during wartime conditions when such goods had become increasingly difficult to obtain.
Mrs. Whitmore welcomed Ashford with her characteristic warmth and attention, immediately recognizing his profession and expressing interest in his business experiences during such challenging times. Their conversations revealed Mrs. Whitmore's sophisticated understanding of international commerce, European markets, and the complex financial arrangements necessary for conducting trade during wartime. Professor Hartwell observed these interactions with growing fascination, noting Mrs. Whitmore's remarkable ability to discuss technical aspects of international commerce with the same expertise she had demonstrated when talking about military strategy with the Confederate officers or agricultural techniques with the German immigrants. Her knowledge seemed to encompass virtually every subject that might interest her diverse guests. Ashford had planned to remain at Whitmore Estate for 3 days while waiting for a steamboat that would take him north to St. Louis. He spent his first 2 days at the estate engaging in animated conversations with fellow guests, sharing stories about his travels throughout Europe before the war and his observations about changing business conditions in various American cities. On the morning of February 18th, Ashford failed to appear for breakfast, an unusual occurrence given his consistent punctuality during his previous days at the estate. Mrs. Whitmore personally checked on his guest suite, returning to announce that Ashford had apparently left the estate early that morning to catch an earlier steamboat than originally planned. She explained to the concerned guests that Ashford had received word the previous evening about an unexpected business opportunity that required him to accelerate his travel schedule. Mrs. Whitmore produced a brief note written in Ashford's handwriting, thanking her for her hospitality and explaining his sudden departure. The note mentioned his intention to catch the Dawn River boat to St. Louis and his regret at having to leave without properly bidding farewell to his fellow guests. Professor Hartwell accepted this explanation initially, recognizing that wartime conditions often forced travelers to modify their plans with little advance notice. The transportation schedules that had once provided reliable service throughout the Mississippi Valley had become increasingly unpredictable as military priorities took precedence over civilian needs. However, several aspects of Ashford's departure struck Professor Hartwell as unusual upon further reflection. The merchant had spoken enthusiastically about his plans to spend additional time at Whitmore Estate, describing it as a welcome respite from the stress and danger of travel through hostile territory. He had also expressed particular interest in attending a musical evening that Mrs. Whitmore had planned for February 18th, featuring a professional pianist who was traveling through the region. More significantly, Ashford had left behind several valuable items in his guest suite, including a gold pocket watch and a leather portfolio containing important business documents. When Professor Hartwell mentioned these forgotten items to Mrs. Whitmore, she assured him that she would arrange to forward them to Ashford at his next scheduled destination. The steamboat captain who had supposedly taken Ashford to St. Louis arrived at Whitmore Estate later that morning to collect other passengers who had made reservations for the northbound journey. When Professor Hartwell casually inquired about Ashford's early morning departure, the captain expressed confusion, stating that no passengers had boarded his vessel before its scheduled departure time. Mrs. Whitmore quickly resolved this apparent contradiction by explaining that Ashford must have taken passage on a different vessel, possibly a freight barge, that sometimes carried passengers when space was available. She noted that several such vessels had passed the estate's private dock during the early morning hours, and that Ashford might have negotiated passage on one of them to ensure he didn't miss his business opportunity. This explanation seemed plausible, given the irregular transportation arrangements that had become common during wartime, when civilian travelers often had to accept whatever opportunities became available. Professor Hartwell accepted Mrs. Whitmore's account and thought little more about Ashford's departure until subsequent events began to establish a disturbing pattern. 3 weeks after Cornelius Ashford's mysterious departure, another guest at Whitmore Estate vanished under circumstances that were remarkably similar, yet sufficiently different to avoid creating obvious connections between the two incidents. Mrs. Adelaide Thornton was a widow from Memphis, Tennessee, who had been traveling north to Chicago, where she planned to join her sister's family after losing her home to Union occupation forces. Mrs. Thornton carried with her the remnants of her family's wealth, including jewelry, silverware, and a substantial quantity of Confederate currency that she hoped to convert into more stable forms of value in northern financial markets. Mrs. Thornton had arrived at Whitmore Estate on March 8, 1862, presenting herself as a refugee from the war's devastation, who was seeking safe passage through Missouri's dangerous territory. Mrs. Whitmore welcomed her with particular warmth, expressing sympathy for the hardships that Mrs. Thornton had endured and admiration for her courage in undertaking such a dangerous journey. The two women quickly established a close relationship based on their shared Southern heritage and similar experiences with wartime loss and displacement. Mrs. Whitmore's ability to understand and empathize with Mrs. Thornton's situation seemed to provide genuine comfort to a woman who had been struggling to maintain her composure while dealing with devastating personal losses.
Professor Hartwell observed their interactions with professional interest, noting how Mrs. Whitmore's emotional intelligence allowed her to provide exactly the kind of support that Mrs. Thornton needed. Their conversations often continued long into the evening, covering topics that ranged from practical matters like travel arrangements and financial planning to more personal subjects like grief, resilience, and the challenge of rebuilding one's life after losing everything. Mrs. Thornton had planned to remain at Whitmore Estate for approximately 1 week while waiting for favorable weather conditions and reliable transportation to complete her journey to Chicago. She expressed particular appreciation for the security and comfort that the estate provided, describing it as a sanctuary where she could recover her strength before facing the challenges that awaited her in an unfamiliar northern city. On the morning of March 14th, Mrs. Thornton failed to appear for breakfast, repeating the pattern established by Cornelius Ashford's disappearance 3 weeks earlier. Mrs. Whitmore again personally checked the missing guest's suite, returning with another handwritten note explaining the sudden departure. According to Mrs. Whitmore's explanation, Mrs. Thornton had received unexpected word that her sister's family in Chicago was preparing to relocate to California, creating an urgent need for Mrs. Thornton to reach them before they departed. The note expressed gratitude for Mrs. Whitmore's hospitality while explaining that Mrs. Thornton had arranged passage on a freight wagon that was traveling north and could not delay its departure. Professor Hartwell found this second disappearance more troubling than the first,
particularly because Mrs. Thornton had seemed to be developing genuine emotional attachment to Whitmore Estate and its hostess. The previous evening, Mrs. Thornton had spoken enthusiastically about the possibility of extending her stay, mentioning that she felt safer and more comfortable at the estate than she had since leaving Memphis. Like Ashford before her, Mrs. Thornton had left behind valuable personal items, including a jewelry box containing several pieces that she had described as family heirlooms with both financial and sentimental value. When Professor Hartwell mentioned these forgotten items to Mrs. Whitmore, she again assured him that she would arrange to forward them to the departed guest. More disturbing was the discovery that Mrs. Thornton's room showed signs of hasty packing, with clothing and personal items scattered in ways that suggested either extreme urgency or possible disturbance. Mrs. Whitmore explained that Mrs. Thornton had been forced to pack quickly due to the unexpected nature of her travel opportunity, and that the excitement of potentially reuniting with her family had left her somewhat disorganized. Professor Hartwell's academic training in criminal anthropology had taught him to recognize patterns in human behavior, and he began to notice similarities between the two disappearances that extended beyond mere coincidence. Both guests had been carrying substantial wealth in easily portable forms. Both had established close relationships with Mrs. Whitmore that seemed to provide detailed information about their resources and travel plans. Both had vanished during early morning hours when other guests were unlikely to observe their departures. Most significantly, both disappearances had been explained by handwritten notes that provided plausible but ultimately unverifiable explanations for sudden changes in travel plans. Professor Hartwell's experience with document analysis raised questions about the authenticity of these notes, although he lacked the resources to conduct proper examination of the handwriting and paper. The third disappearance occurred in April 1862, involving Dr. Marcus Goldstein, a physician from Cincinnati who had been traveling to New Orleans to investigate reports of unusual disease outbreaks in Union-occupied territory. Dr. Goldstein was known throughout the medical community for his research into infectious diseases and his development of innovative treatment protocols that had saved thousands of lives during recent cholera epidemics.
Dr. Goldstein's disappearance on April 12th followed the same pattern as the previous incidents, complete with a handwritten note explaining his sudden departure and Mrs. Whitmore's sympathetic explanations about unexpected changes in travel arrangements. According to the note, Dr. Goldstein had received urgent word about a disease outbreak that required his immediate attention, forcing him to accept passage on a military transport that could not delay its departure. Professor Hartwell's suspicions crystallized into genuine alarm when he discovered that Dr. Goldstein had left behind his entire collection of medical research notes, documents that represented years of painstaking work and would be essential for his planned activities in New Orleans. When Professor Hartwell pointed out this obvious inconsistency to Mrs. Whitmore, she suggested that Dr. Goldstein had probably taken the most important materials with him while leaving duplicates behind for safety. This explanation failed to satisfy Professor Hartwell, who had observed Dr. Goldstein's meticulous care in organizing and protecting his research materials. The physician had described his notes as irreplaceable and had expressed particular concern about protecting them during his dangerous journey through hostile territory. More troubling was Professor Hartwell's growing recognition that Mrs. Whitmore's explanations for the three disappearances contained subtle inconsistencies and logical problems that became apparent only upon careful analysis. The transportation arrangements described in each case involved carriers and schedules that seemed designed to avoid verification, while the emergency circumstances that supposedly motivated each sudden departure were dramatic enough to justify hasty action but vague enough to prevent detailed investigation. Professor Hartwell began conducting discreet inquiries with transportation operators, local merchants, and other contacts throughout the Hannibal area, attempting to verify the various explanations provided by Mrs. Whitmore. His investigation revealed that none of the departure arrangements described by Mrs. Whitmore could be confirmed by independent sources, while several details appeared to be inconsistent with known facts about transportation schedules and military operations. The riverboat captains who regularly stopped at Whitmore Estate's private dock denied having taken any passengers matching the descriptions of the missing guests. Freight companies operating in the region had no records of providing transportation to individuals matching their identities. Military authorities responsible for issuing travel permits and safe conduct passes had no documentation of the emergency situations that supposedly required immediate departures. Professor Hartwell's academic expertise in criminal behavior patterns led him to recognize that he was observing what appeared to be a systematic operation designed to identify, isolate, and eliminate wealthy travelers under circumstances that would minimize the likelihood of investigation or discovery. The sophistication of Mrs. Whitmore's methods suggested extensive experience in manipulating victims and managing evidence, while her ability to maintain credible explanations indicated careful planning and significant resources. By May 1862, Professor Hartwell had documented evidence suggesting that at least 7 guests had disappeared from Whitmore Estate under suspicious circumstances since Mrs. Whitmore had assumed ownership of the property. His research revealed that each disappeared guest had possessed substantial portable wealth, had established close relations with Mrs. Whitmore that provided detailed information about their resources and plans, and had vanished during early morning hours when their absence would not be immediately noticed. The missing individuals represented a cross-section of Mississippi Valley society that included merchants, professionals, military personnel, and wealthy refugees. Their combined resources would have totaled tens of thousands of dollars in gold, jewelry, and other valuable items, a fortune that would provide substantial motivation for criminal activity even under normal circumstances. Professor Hartwell's investigation also revealed disturbing inconsistencies in Mrs. Whitmore's personal background and the circumstances surrounding her acquisition of the estate. Property records showed that she had paid for the mansion in gold coins at a time when such currency was becoming increasingly scarce throughout the region. Her claimed background as a widow from Savannah could not be verified through any available records, while her demonstrated expertise in diverse professional fields suggested either extensive formal education or significant practical experience that was inconsistent with her stated personal history. More troubling was Professor Hartwell's discovery that several other accommodation providers throughout the Mississippi Valley had reported similar patterns of guest disappearances, involving establishments that had recently changed ownership or management under circumstances similar to those at Whitmore. The geographic distribution of these incidents suggested a coordinated operation that extended far beyond a single location or individual perpetrator. The sophisticated nature of the operation indicated access to extensive resources, detailed intelligence about potential victims, and coordination between multiple participants in different locations. Mrs. Whitmore's ability to maintain credible explanations while eliminating witnesses suggested either exceptional personal skills or professional training in deception and evidence management.
Professor Hartwell recognized that he was dealing with criminal activity that exceeded anything documented in his previous research into deviant behavior patterns. The combination of psychological manipulation, systematic planning, and operational sophistication suggested perpetrators who possessed capabilities typically associated with military or intelligence organizations rather than ordinary criminal enterprises. His academic training had taught him to approach unusual phenomena with scientific objectivity, documenting observations without allowing personal emotions or preconceptions to influence his analysis. But the implications of his findings at Whitmore Estate challenged his ability to maintain professional detachment when confronted with evidence of systematic murder conducted under the guise of refined hospitality.
The question that haunted Professor Hartwell was whether Mrs. Whitmore was acting independently or as part of a larger organization that used similar methods to eliminate travelers throughout the region. The resources required to establish and maintain operations like Whitmore Estate suggested financial backing that exceeded what any individual could provide, while the coordination required to avoid detection by law enforcement authorities indicated systematic corruption or infiltration of official institutions. Professor Hartwell also began to question whether he himself might be in danger, given his academic expertise and his obvious interest in analyzing the disappearances. His research activities had not escaped Mrs. Whitmore's attention, and he had observed her making discreet inquiries about his background, research methods, and travel plans that suggested she was evaluating him as either a potential threat or a potential victim. The professor realized that his position as an outside observer with no personal ties to the local community made him particularly vulnerable if Mrs. Whitmore decided that his investigation posed unacceptable risks to her operation. His academic credentials and federal government connections might provide some protection, but they would also make his disappearance more likely to attract official attention that could threaten the entire enterprise. As Professor Hartwell continued his discreet investigation into the activities at Whitmore Estate, he found himself caught between his professional obligation to document criminal behavior and his personal need to avoid becoming the next victim in what appeared to be an ongoing campaign of systematic murder disguised as gracious Southern hospitality. The challenge he faced was how to gather sufficient evidence to expose Mrs. Whitmore's activities while avoiding the fate that had apparently befallen 7 previous guests who had possessed valuable resources and had somehow attracted her lethal attention. His next decisions would determine whether he could successfully document and expose one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in American history, or whether he would simply become another mysterious disappearance that Mrs. Whitmore would explain with another handwritten note and another plausible but ultimately false story about unexpected travel arrangements. Professor Hartwell's confrontation with Mrs. Whitmore reached its climax when she revealed the full scope of her criminal enterprise. In her hidden chamber beneath the mansion, she had systematically murdered over 100 guests across 15 years, maintaining detailed records of each victim's torture and death as part of what she called scientific research. Her sophisticated criminal network she operated throughout the Mississippi Valley, using luxury boarding establishments as fronts for identifying and eliminating wealthy travelers. Her victims included merchants, professionals, military officers, and refugees, all carefully selected for their portable wealth and lack of strong institutional connections. Mrs. Whitmore's revelation that she intended Professor Hartwell to become her next research subject triggered a desperate struggle. Using his knowledge of the mansion's layout, gained through weeks of investigation, Hartwell managed to escape and alert federal authorities in St. Louis. When Union forces raided Whitmore Estate in July 1862, they found the hidden chamber with its horrific evidence, but Mrs. Whitmore had vanished. Her criminal network collapsed, though several associated establishments continued operating until the war's end. The official records were sealed to prevent panic about the transportation system's vulnerability. Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore was never captured, and her ultimate fate remains unknown. The mansion was abandoned and eventually demolished, its dark secrets buried with its foundations. Professor Hartwell's detailed documentation of the case became one of the first systematic studies of serial murder in American criminology, though it remained classified for decades. Some historians believe Mrs. Whitmore's network was responsible for hundreds of disappearances throughout the antebellum and Civil War periods, making her potentially America's most prolific killer. Her combination of social sophistication and systematic brutality challenged contemporary understanding of criminal behavior and established new frameworks for studying organized violence.
This chilling tale reminds us that evil often wears the most refined masks, and that our assumptions about civilization and human nature can blind us to the darkest realities. If this story has captivated you, subscribe to our channel for more investigations into America's forgotten horrors, and let us know in the comments which historical mystery you'd like us to explore next. History's darkest secrets are often hidden in plain sight.